The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres has called for far-reaching reforms to the structure of international finance to serve the needs of developing countries more efficiently. The UN chief said that the African economies and countries are getting a raw deal from the international financial system, which charges them extortionate interest rates. The coronavirus pandemic pushed many poor countries into debt distress, as they were expected to continue servicing their obligations in spite of the massive shock to their finances. On the continent, the pandemic pushed millions of Africans into poverty and reversed the economic and development gains of the past 2 decades. In 2022, the International Monetary Fund noted that public debt ratios in sub-Saharan Africa were at their highest in more than 2 decades. Governments on the continent have sought debt restructuring deals under an IMF program to help them navigate the crisis, and many more countries are expected to seek some form of debt relief or forgiveness this year. Joining me now is Obele. He's the chief economist for Streetnomics as we get into debt distress, debt forgiveness, and the African debt trap. Gospel, that's a term we hear a lot of in recent times, this conversation around this debt trap that African countries seem to have found themselves in. And in recent times, there's been a large portion of the blame put on the coronavirus pandemic. But alarm bells were ringing even before the pandemic. For a country such as Nigeria, those alarm bells were going off. A country such as Kenya, we know Zambia as well, alarm bells before the pandemic. So how did African countries find themselves in this point in time?
Thank you so much, Tolulope. Really great to speak with you again. So the pandemic only made more visible, the challenges that already existed everywhere in the world. It made more visible management excesses, public leadership excesses, as the case may be. One thing we've seen very clearly in Africa, taking Nigeria for example, is that there's been a gross, huge fiscal indiscipline in the context of public finance over the past 3 to 4 decades, and we've seen how these conversations have evolved. Even when state actors sought to, win debt release or debt forgiveness, for instance, what the current DG of WTO, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, did with the Paris Club in 2003-04. We've seen how almost 60% of our debts were forgiven. But over the years coming up until now, we've seen how Nigeria has even, reached a more worse situation compared to where it was in 2002. So technically, we've seen that the challenge is not necessarily the fact that our debt is really worsening. Is usually the economics and the leadership or management of the economy behind these conversations that has worsened it to this point. And it largely cuts across huge fiscal indiscipline. And that fiscal indiscipline is hinged on the fact that you have a very poorly industrialized economy or poorly industrialized region, who is not doing enough to serve the global market in terms of FX exchange, revenue mobilization, as the case may be. So there are still huge concerns around the revenue side of most African countries, as it pertains to being able to be self-reliant in funding most of your developmental aspirations. But then again, the current debt conversation is a global conversation. The UK is also faced with a huge debt burden, and it's on the top of mind for the current Prime Minister. So give or take, it's a global conversation, but for Africa, it's been more of a history of fiscal indiscipline than just debt itself.
Okay, so I'm going to follow up with that in terms of the fiscal indiscipline, because coming out of the last major world economic sort of recession that we had, things were slightly different. Everybody seemed to be in a better place, and African economies were able to get a lot of this debt and loans at a much cheaper rate. But now all of that has caught up with us. So at the end of 2021, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank considered 16 low-income African countries to be at high risk of debt distress. As of February 2022, that number was now 23 African countries, which were either in debt distress or at risk of it. And in October 2022, a United Nations Conference on Trade and Development report found that almost 60% of Africa's low-income countries were in debt distress or at high risk of it. That include Chad, the Republic of Congo, Mozambique, while Somalia, Sudan, and Zimbabwe were already in debt distress. And by the time 2022 was over, Ghana and Tunisia had also joined the list. So you talk about this fiscal indiscipline that seems to be a common thread. It's sort of like a boom and bust cycle, which we'll get to in the end, that what African countries go through. But let's look at that in particular. What's this fiscal indiscipline that so many of our economies seem to have in common, but also not forgetting the fact that there are infrastructure deficits, there are civil servants and a civil society or organization structure, public service structure that also gets flagged continuously by the IMF, but then many African countries are unable to deal with. So let's get into that. What's the commonality that you see between all of us?
Yeah, so first to say that fiscal indiscipline is sort of a major issue globally, but it exists in different nuances, especially when depending on where you're looking at it from. From the African axis, from the African context, is largely the inability to mobilize money, the inability to spend correctly, spend wisely, to cut waste, and the inability to plug in the monies you've saved or the monies you have in your coffers, into key productive sectors for productivity gains. So that cycle of poor capacity / lack of will and lack of reform approach towards public spending. It's what we term as, to a very large extent, fiscal indiscipline. So, and we've seen that to a very large extent. In terms of, instead of investing in key sectors that would help your economy thrive, you're investing in things that would enable the waste economy or expand further leakages within the economy. And it's also, to a very large extent, it's a culture in our region in terms of a culture of waste, and there's a poor public leadership when it comes to visioneering for reforms, and ensuring that resources, because actually resources are only one part of that whole process of visioneering and executing for reforms. Resources are only one part, but they are one of the major part that determines if you will actually reach reforms or not. So Africa has talked about reforms on many grounds, and there've been a lot of resources available, at least, and the resources available haven't been geared correctly, to sectors or to spaces or investments that will bring the right productivity gains. Instead, in many cases, they've been used to recycle leakages. They've been used to, strengthen the extractive institutional players in many cases, and we've seen how poverty and many other social problems have worsened over the years, despite the fact that a lot of investments have come into the economy, quote unquote, through debt financing, as the case may be. So, take for instance Nigeria. We have a lot of these challenges, and we cannot really boast of one productive sector right now. And our debt is currently on the rise. So that's what fiscal discipline would mean to a very large extent, and it's largely about a culture. It's a behavioral pattern, a culture, a political ideology, than the money themselves. Yeah.
Okay, so let's get to what UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has to say about African debt. He was speaking at the opening ceremony of the annual African Union Summit in Ethiopia.
Assembly on the multiple interlinked challenges confronting our world, greater than any in our lifetimes. And in many ways, the people of Africa are bearing the brunt of this crisis. A dysfunctional and unfair global financial system that is failing developing countries when they need it most. The deep inequalities in the availability of resources for the recovery from the pandemic. A cost of living crisis exacerbated by the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Climate chaos that the people of Africa did very little to cause, that is whipping up floods and deadly droughts, putting communities and lives at risk and displacing millions. And peace and security threats, often involving interests and profits far beyond the continent's borders. Excellencies, across all these areas, the message is clear: Africa needs action. First, economic action. Africa is rich with potential, but it's not rich in global support. Investing in Africa pathways to prosperity requires finance, and developing countries are repeatedly left in the lurch. The global financial system routinely denies them debt relief and concessional financing while charging extortionate.
And so you hear him there talking about the global financial system routinely denying developing countries debt relief and concessional financing while charging extortionate interest rates. There was once, I guess I would call it some kind of message that I heard from a woman who used to be very involved in a lot of this international World Bank centers. And she said that the countries that need the concessional financing, the cheaper interest rates, African economies, many of them, they don't get it. But the countries like the US, like maybe even countries in the UK and even countries in Europe that don't really need it, they get that concessional financing. And many people think it becomes sort of like this play to keep African economies and the African continent down. But let's start from the financial global system. How does it continue to deny developing countries, like many on the continent, what they need when it comes to debt and concessional financing?
To be honest with you, Tolulope, I would not really, that argument seems to be correct, but I have a different thinking to that. African countries themselves have not proven to be responsible. I'm not talking about Africans now. African countries, continents, leaders, and co. have not proven to be responsible in the global scheme of things. The question is, what is Africa bringing into the table in the global economics of things? And how are we pushing our own organized, emphasis on the word organized, agenda in the global scheme of things? It's just a very simple thing. So those who get low concessionary rates and all that, it's not necessarily because they deserve it or not, in as much as the argument is valid. But if you look at it very, very well, there are some form of win-win benefits across board that exist on that top level of exchange in terms of what you rub my back, I rub your back kind of thing, in quotes. So technically, what does Africa have to bring on the negotiation table? What does Africa have that the US needs, that the United Kingdom needs, that Europe needs so bad that Africa can take that as a means to have that conversation, to exchange for lower concessionary rates and all that? Africa doesn't have anything. Take, for instance, what has Nigeria taken to the table on the ESCFTA? Nothing. So we need that. We are not even organized as a continent in terms of pushing our agenda forward. So we've long been perceived as a continent that is largely dependent on the West. In as much as there are many dynamics to that argument, there is also the part where we need to begin to present ourselves. For instance, you have the US Africa Summit, UK Africa Summit, Europe Africa Summit, Japan African Summit. When would you have the reverse in terms of Africa seeking to host these people to sort of, explain and put forward your agenda or negotiating power in terms of what you want from them and what they want from you and how you can strike a deal going forward? We have nothing. So until you have something to the table and that thing is at a level where the world cannot resist or ignore you, we would remain at the position where we will be treated unfairly. And we live in an unfair world. And until we begin to recognize that, until activists, change agents, and people who are seeking to create change in the space begin to recognize that, then we'll not be able to do the right homework to organize our narrative going forward. So I think that's a major part. And we've seen how that has also played in terms of exchange rates. We've seen how that has played in terms of protecting the dollar as against the pound and euros, vis-a-vis the dollar as against the Ghanaian cedi and the naira. We've seen how that global economies work. We are in the era of currency wars. And at the apex of that political game is that a lot of monetary economics decisions are being made in disfavor of Africa, in quotes, disfavor of Africa, because we've not had anything to offer. So I think we need to do more around looking inwards, organizing our narrative, organizing our markets, pushing our argument and our strongest comparative points forward. What's happening right now is that different African countries are trying to do that as a standalone.
As individuals.
As alone and all that. And it doesn't work contextually in the scheme of global politics. So we need to move as a strong region. And as a region, we're actually stronger. A lot of foreign brands and FMCG brands, retail market brands, are seeking to find their inroads into Africa. And there is a reason why. The market is here, the money is here. Those guys understand it, but we do not have anything in terms of managing or pushing our agenda forward. Take, for instance, when an African president gets into the UN, what does he or she say in terms of the positioning, the narrative, the argument, and the strong, deals they have to bring to the table and all that? There's really technically nothing. So until we become much more self-reliant, we believe in what we have, and we organize ourselves on that, not from a victim perspective, but literally from a victor's perspective, in pushing stronger arguments forward, I do not think the world will ever take us seriously. And these arguments will keep happening. So, recently, because of inflation, the Russia-Ukraine war, we've seen high interest rates. Interest rates have been high everywhere in the world. But you see, on the grounds of the worsening state of monetary economies, some countries still get good rates in terms of pushing in their debts and all that. And when I started this conversation, I mentioned that the UK, for instance, is facing a huge debt burden. And that's part of the top 5 priorities of Rishi Sunak as we speak. All right. So, but then again, in as much as it's top level, you realize that there are conversations going on because you have that allied sort of relationship, among countries in the West, and they're using that leverage to cut down on rates and all of that to manage all of these debt relief, debt management, and distress and all that. But you see, for Africa, the conversation is different. The conversation is different because we've not been able to position ourselves in a global scheme of things, and that's a major part of the argument that we're not ready to focus on because it's a tough conversation to have.
And it's interesting you say that because Antonio Guterres was speaking to African leaders at the opening session of the annual AU summit. And that would be no better place for the continent to really come up from there and have a unified front on that, which also leads me to this conversation around what even has been happening in the debt restructuring and debt talk situation. So we've seen that there have been some attempts. You have the G20 coming together and presenting the G20 common framework on debt treatments, but that hasn't really made a lot of progress. It's been criticized for a slow pace and a slow turnaround. But have we seen any, even if it's been an individual conversation that an African country has had, have we seen any successful conversation or successful attempt to restructure debt, to offer debt relief, or to even begin the process? Zambia's process has been stalled since mid last year. Now we know that Ghana is in conversations as well, back to the IMF. Egypt is back to the IMF. Tunisia is back to the IMF. Has there been any success since the pandemic when everybody says Africa's debt is something to worry about? But we're almost 2-3 years down the line, Africa's debt is still the same situation. Gospel.
I really seen a success from an individual country. And also a lot of countries are finding their ways and arguments back again to the IMF. And let's not forget that the past 1 year have been threatened heavily with interest rates and downside monetary policy economics that's eating deep into the public finance and of many African countries. As a result of that, already distressed or potentially distressed African economies run into full state distress, and they're sort of finding their ways back again to the IMF. The same story all over again. For Nigeria, it's been happening since the 1980s. All right. So the truth is, I do not think that we can win this battle as individual entities trying to get an argument or a plus going with the IMF. I think we need to organize our home front, which is also very challenging. On many fronts, we are divided internally. On many fronts, we're divided internally. So we need to begin to organize our own G7, G20, G25, whatever the G would be, and begin to position a constructive argument. Again, a constructive argument to the West. So take, for instance, the AFCFTA now. The AFCFTA is a good platform to engage the West on many footings, on many grounds, representing African countries. So the AFCFTA, for instance, hasn't really been positioned proactively in engaging the Western markets and the globalized markets in context. It has technically sought to resolve its own market issues, which again is still very, very, very they've been struggling so many times with that. So I think we need to first organize ourselves and then take our arguments forward. The IMF will treat Ghana differently, they will treat Tunisia differently, treat Zambia differently, and they're going to probably push different terms and conditions to different countries. And those terms and conditions, in the real sense of things, will actually end up dividing or splitting our monetary realities farther apart than helping us converge. And that's one thing that the West has also mastered. So within the context of Africa, in as much as we may not necessarily need to have a single currency, but we need to have a point of convergence on our monetary interest. And then we begin to take that interest as a bargaining power to the West. The world collaborates and argues on interest, not necessarily on what I want or what you want. It's primarily based on interest. So I've not yet seen that alignment on interest that can be taken to the center stage as a means of negotiation by African countries. What's happening and what will keep happening is if we keep going individually, the West will keep splitting us apart. And in our division and further inequality, as the case may be, would be much more difficulties in the future for us to even win any developmental conversation globally, in context to the region at large and even individual countries.
So it's interesting because we know that there are several countries on the continent that this year, 2024 and 2025, have massive debt payments to make. And there are a lot of questions as to whether or not these countries will be able to make those payments. Many have said that Ghana has defaulted in everything but name only by not paying the investors of its debt bonds just about a few months ago. We saw the situation in Egypt as well, where we saw foreign investors simply just exit the country in mass. We saw the situation as well in Nigeria, I think second quarter of 2022, when the country's debt servicing overtook the country's revenue at the long run. So we have these debt obligations and debt payments coming up this year, next year, 2025, and there's a lot of question as to what's going to happen. Looking at the three countries I mentioned, Egypt, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya is also there. I think they have a debt payments coming up, I think sometime either this year or next year, about $500 million thereabouts. What do you think is going to happen when these obligations come due? Because it's also a question about being able to bring the creditors to the table. BlackRock has right now refused to join the conversation when it comes to the Zambian debt talks right now. China seems to be the one delaying. So either you help us to pay you or you sit back and watch us default, and then what happens? So what do you think is going to happen with some of the payments that are coming due in the next few years?
I mean, like you said, it's either they're being paid or they look for either a restructuring or find new terms and conditions to deal with the creditors, for a soft landing. Either point on those three conversations, I mean, if they choose to land for the first, second, or third, would also reinforce our dependency position. So if you choose to renegotiate your terms in terms of how you restructure to pay back, the creditor has an upper hand. I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say. The creditor has an upper hand because it can introduce more conditions, to make it seem like you have a softer landing, but they've trapped you further for another 10 to 15 years. So that's one hand. The second hand will be that, we can't pay you, we're distressing. That's also going to affect investments into the region and all that. So technically, either way you look at it, it's still going to, strengthen that dependency position and that victim position. So what I think will be that in the interim, African governments need to start discussing and having honest conversations amongst themselves on what's the most sustainable pathway going forward. We are all resource rich. I mean, that's the interesting thing. Most African countries are resource rich. How can we begin to tap into that industrialization power? What's the vision? What's the ideology that we need to bring to the table to encourage inclusion, human capital, and all that, and begin to push our argument forward? I think Africa has what it takes, to fund their developmental aspirations. That's one. Second, I think Africa also has what it takes to enable and support one another. It's just like a being your brother's keeper kind of campaign, as the case may be. So if we begin to look inwards and we begin to harness that power of unity, especially on the points of our interest, where our interests and challenges align the most, at least maybe top 5 or top 3 or top 2 to start with, then it will begin to make sense for us in the future in terms of having a way to close this debt conversation once and for all. We may not be able to fully close it, but we will be able to position ourselves in such a way that we have the upper hand in the negotiation argument and the negotiations here going forward in the future. But the current way it is right now, I do not think that any African country can really cut through, because these guys, in many ways, they have many ways to hold us back, and they're sort of economically much more buoyant to hold us back as well. So, and until those conversations begin to find a much more leveling playing field, I do not think we're going to make progress with it as a continent. It's quite unfortunate, but I think we can really do more for ourselves.
All right, Gospel, before I let you go, we've spoken about the potential for a global recession. While it seems the World Bank and the IMF have sort of reduced their numbers in terms of how deep a recession may be, there's still those fears. It's still very much a potential, particularly with the U.S. Federal Reserve holding on to its hawkish stance. But what would a recession right now, what would a global recession right now mean for African countries and our debt situation? That's my final question.
Honestly, it's going to be catastrophic because many African countries would be left in a very, very worse state. Let's not forget that we have a lot of fragile states in Africa. So it's really going to be very bad, and we are not ready to come in terms with this truth to start with. So the first hope is that the world doesn't go into a global recession, but some African countries are likely going to get into a recession by virtue of the current economic realities that they are faced with, and not just the economy is going into a recession, but the state of the social economy would actually worsen in terms of poverty, in terms of cost of living, and all that internal crisis that would exude as a result of the current state of things. So I think it's going to be very catastrophic. Again, reasons why this AU summit and the communiques and post-summit events need to be taken seriously. Unfortunately, many African presidents are very extractive in their ideology, which also presents a lot of clash around where we need to agree on, why we need to work together and all that, and begin to build necessary allies. So it's really going to be very bad. But sometimes it takes a level of disruption for people to wake up, in all sense of honesty. It takes a level of disruption. And I think Africa has slept for a long time. And if this is the disruption that would awaken a lot of African countries, maybe it just needs to happen.
All right, looking for a silver lining, that cloud that many say is looming on the horizon. Gospel Obele, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.